Hey guys, Morphologist here, and I am here with a good portion of the environment design team. Well, there's a lot of you guys.
Environment art team for the locations.
Environment art team.
So PU locations, yeah.
PU locations. Okay,
So I'm Nick Etheridge. I'm the lead environment artist for the landing zone team.
Okay.
I'm Eddie. I'm the lead on the Modular team.
And I'm Luan. I'm one of the environment artists on the landing zone team.
Okay. So we have a lot of landing zone information here, which is good because the microtech's coming out. And then you were working on the stations, I guess, because the modular system is associated with that as well.
Exactly, yeah.
So do you have? We should go over what everybody
Sure.
kind of does. But does that include then stuff like the design itself, or are you more into the mechanics of how those systems work together?
I know very much the design of them. Obviously we work closely with the concept guys in the inn on the art direction side of things for a sort of initial idea. My job is very much how to translate those concepts into the game, make it run within budget, and obviously work with designers as well to make it a fun and sort of logical gameplay experience as well, yeah.
All right, cool. And then Nick, you said you do the mostly the landing zone. So what's like a typical day at the office for you?
So a typical day at the office is catching up with the whole team because there's about 11 guys, 9, 10 guys in the UK, and then we've got a few guys in the German office that also work on landing zones. So it's touching base with everyone, seeing what they're working on. I sit next to Ian, the art director, so I catch up with him and make sure everything's kind of working towards the art direction, getting the right visual design that he wants, looking at concept art, playing the build, checking the city, talking to production, make sure we're tracking all right with tasks and so on. Talking to the tech artists on performance. I try as much as possible to do art myself. Even though I'm a lead, I don't get to do as much art as I'd like to.
But you started as doing art, obviously, right?
Yeah,
so it's
yeah.
kind of like your passion still. I can understand that.
So lately I've been doing a lot of world building with like the new Babbage landing zone and kind of more high-level composition. So there isn't a typical day, if I'm honest, but it's all of those kind of things. And yeah, just working on like the landing zone as a whole, and we do landing zones, but we also like the anniversary sale is part of a landing zone, so we would do that kind of thing, which is coming out shortly. So Luan had a pretty monumental part of that landing zone of the anniversary sale. It was him and just another artist, but he was driving it, so he can take a lot of credit actually for the anniversary sale.
Pink was my idea.
He did the donut tile, which was originally just going to be like a big cool mega structure, but even when we did that, we thought that would be a really cool place for an anniversary sale. So that was him. I can move on to him.
So,
I'm told, or?
Yeah. Luan, so then same goes for you. It seems like you kind of work. Nick kind of directs a lot of the moving parts inside the office, and then you're more focused on the specific like designs on like a given area. So you did like the anniversary sale area.
Right. So I'm a lot more boots on the ground. So my responsibilities are really more on the making assets. I do a lot of the surfaces, materials, and textures for the team.
Okay.
And lately, one of my tasks in between all the new Babbage craziness has been working on the anniversary sale. So we found the donut building that I did a little while ago, and we thought it'd be a really good idea to put something in there. Maybe the anniversary sale might be a good idea in there, right? So the first thing I did when I reopened that file, I thought, I'm going to put a tunnel in this, and you're going to go right through it. So that was one of the most fun things. And when we saw the transit going through and everything, going right down to the middle, that just kind of started coming together as like a really interesting new location to go to. So then it was just really about sort of getting what we've already done in Area 18 and translating that into the donut itself, right? And then making the holographic ads, getting that pink in there. That was a fun battle for me.
Looks great. I like
I'm
it.
very
It worked.
proud of
It
that
works.
thing. Yeah.
It's a really big
works
risk,
for
but it
Artcorp,
works.
Artcorp can be brave with its lighting and the art.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a lot more sort of that boots on the ground kind of thing.
Cool. So now let's just dive straight into like the design of the game and everything you guys do with no specific aim wherever you guys want to go. But I think obviously the landing zone is a great place to start, or the stations. Even.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's. I think it's a question of the game as a whole. I think scale is a very important subject that we have across stations, landing zones, whatever we do. It's something we covered in the presentations earlier a little bit. But for a game where you can go from meter scale first person all the way up to millions of kilometers seamlessly, something like a space station that you can fly around, approach, zip past at a very high speed in a ship, but also fly up to reasonably close and slowly and then get on a landing pad and walk around. It's a really difficult challenge across the board to sell scale. And I think what we talked about in the presentation about how trees and you need a human reference for scale, right? You need to be able to, you need to say, I recognize what that thing is, and I can see a lot of them going off into the distance, so I know that thing over there is very, very big. And we use windows a lot for that as well, little pinpoints of lights on the stations. That's the sort of how we sell scale, really, isn't it?
Yeah, without those elements, it's really hard to tell. Like, you could put a space station, because it's above a planet, you're like, well, how big is that station? Is that like kilometers? Is that like hundreds of meters? It's really hard, and things like windows obviously help a lot, like Eddie said.
I don't want to use this interview to throw shade, but I used to play a lot of EVE Online, and one of the things that I always found interesting or kind of struggle with that game when I played it is understanding scale. Even that, I had windows, I never really appreciated how massive those things are, and I can't really fly straight up to them. So you guys are really like, there's definitely a challenge.
It's been a challenge in our game since we've started working on this game, really. Like, how even in the early days of Arena Commander, it's like how do we make stuff where we can show that sense of scale? And because we can make planets and these big things we can throw in, it's always been a challenge of like, okay, how do we ground it? How do we bring the player, and how do we make it recognizable? So we, like back a long time ago, we tried putting things like ladders on the side of space stations and things, and it was just like, you don't even see them because they're so small, so it's always been a challenge, and a technical challenge as well, because of rendering it and having things that will, for example, a ladder would be like smaller than a pixel, so it would actually just disappear. So that's no good for selling scale. So we had to be a bit more creative about like how we do that with panel lines and greebles and like detail, like putting that in the right place, and working with the tech to help with those challenges.
We actually have that problem in the real world. So good architecture, I would argue, is something that recognizes the human scale, the actual human being in the space. So when you approach a building or you approach a very large space, successful spaces, I would argue, always have a delineation or a breakdown of the vertical using either panelization or like the top of a doorway that has like a connecting line, something to not only just adds user comfort, but gives a sense of the scale of the place, which helps the user somehow, and I don't know the psychology specifically about it, feel more comfortable.
Right. Yeah. Like there is something very uncomfortable when you see monolithic structures that don't sell that sense of scale.
But at the same time, as a game designer, that can also be a great tool for
sure.
For like
if
lore
you want
build.
to deliberately show that, then it's
to feel
great.
oppressive and brutal.
Yeah. I think you see that a lot in the CBD and Lorville and stuff like that. Yeah, you want to feel looked down upon the whole time you're in that place. You want to feel loomed over. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, a lot of the challenges with that early on that we do when we're doing a visual target of something like a building or a space station is getting those materials right. And the paneling, we have gone through so many iterations of how to do panels in a way that's effective in large scale, all the way down to like sort of the medium to close read. And actually one of my challenges in ArtCorp when we were doing sort of the really large scale like spaceport stuff was how do we use the where? What's happening behind me?
It's Jared's happening behind you.
Jared, come on. You're not the only one who can do interviews, you know.
I'm throwing shade.
But yeah,
he's got a whiskey. Oh, never mind.
Oh, I'll have one.
I think that's brilliant.
But yeah, so one of the main challenges with that is how do we do the wear, for example, on the panels? How does this wear help cell scale? How do we add scale to the greebles in a way that it feels humane? So one of those things is antennas, lights, fog really helps cell scale, right? But that's the
Huge,
different thing.
hugely, yeah.
Distribution of those details as well. I mean, we talk a lot, especially with the exteriors of the stations, iRest versus noise, the ratios of noisy bits to iRest bits, and I mean, none of us are actually architects. You're the architect. It's like we have sort of artistic sensibilities, and we kind of appreciate kind of what looks right to the eye, and we maybe sort of dabble and do a tiny bit of research into sort of architecture and stuff. I think obviously seeing your stuff and sort of commenting on it, and from a point of view of an architect, is really interesting, and it sort of bolsters our.
Well, I think there's a few things. It's kind of why I wanted to chat to you, really, because I think what you do is really good, because there's kind of a feedback loop of an actual architect looking at the design language of our game and analyzing it, and for the good and the bad, giving critique where it's needed and stuff is really cool.
The bins in the CBD were a topic for quite a long time.
But even I remember when you saw an earlier version of ArtCorp and you said it hasn't got the depth of the trenches. It wasn't deep enough, and funnily enough, I don't think we had shown the newer trenches that we'd made. So they you just didn't see how deep they were. But based off watching your stuff, we were actually okay, let's just make them deeper, just for good measure.
Well, it's not just about the deepness. So in architecture,
I don't know why I'm giving.
No, sorry. Are you?
You're
the guy. So in architecture, obviously we have real-world constraints. But when it comes to more to the design side, we very much approach it the same way that game designers do. It's about the user experience and what we want to achieve. And for me, to just go back, because I do remember very vividly in my initial criticism of it, and I apologize, I didn't see the
No, it was legitimate criticism, because what you saw...
we deal in constructive criticism.
Yeah,
right?
we have an art director that does the exact same thing, and if we didn't take criticism well, we wouldn't be good artists. We have to. We critique each other. We've got an art director, we've got leads, and we've got even a junior artist who points out a flaw shouldn't be just ignored or anything, because it's all feedback, and it's not. Yeah, it's a good attitude. The sign of a good artist is someone that's never really happy with their work at the end of the day. An artist's work is never done, as I say. If someone's oh yeah, this is my artwork's amazing, then they're probably not a great artist in general.
Unless they're speaking to a client.
Exactly. You've got to sell yourself.
So constructive criticism is what we want, really, because we like that, because it's we can see where we need to improve and learn for the future, and make the next landing zone better, and.
Well, let's talk criticism then about the newest landing zone. So going back quickly just to ArtCorp to refresh your memory about what I was specifically talking about. When I think about a design of a place, of a location, I try to think about what's the core feeling that I want the user to have. Now, I would think ArtCorp, and this was just me kind of obviously standing in your shoes, obviously you can choose your own direction, but what I was thinking is, ArtCorp it should be very vertical. It has this feeling of very vertical buildings, but we already have Thurston, which is very horizontal, right? Very planted, very heavy. And so the first initial experience I had with the images, with the landing zone, was a flat ground. It felt horizontal, and I didn't really get to experience that really vertical thing that I was kind of hoping to see with ArtCorp. But you guys really did actually come back, especially with the Area 18 area where you come in with the tram. It really does start to sell that really vertical nature of the city.
Definitely with Area 18, we wanted to feel like you're in the middle of the strata of the city. The city continues above you, and it continues below you.
Right.
But you sit somewhere in the middle.
And I think that would be the ideal location, in my opinion, to be for the user experience, to sell that really almost Coruscant-like feeling, right? So now I want to lead into what we saw today with Microtech.
So what did you think with Microtech and New Babbage?
But to be honest, I haven't had very much time to think about it. But one of the biggest things that I immediately noticed was an improvement in the sense of scale of the buildings themselves. And I think what it came down to is the connection point with the ground, because with Area 18 and with, and to some extent that's on purpose, but specifically maybe then more with Hurston, is it's very hard to understand the scale of the buildings outside of the window sizes and what have you, because there's no understandable, there's no roads, there's no sidewalks or cars that I can see, so it's hard to understand the connection with the ground, like how big are they actually? And when you fly up, you're like, oh my god, these are huge, but you don't really appreciate it as much.
Well, we even found that with ArtCorp, right? It all. When we're working in the editor, we're flying around these buildings and everything, and you're locked into this sort of view, and you start to sort of feel like
the thing you're about to say, we have the same problem in architecture. It's like it's being too stuck in the model space and not putting yourself back on the human level.
Exactly.
So even in school now, we're starting to teach more about having to get back into like a 2-foot view, or 2-meter view of the world, so you stop designing it from above, because that's not how people experience spaces, right? So sorry to interrupt you, but it seems like you're about to get into that.
No, but yeah, that's precisely it. It's one of our main issues, right? And one of the things I found in ArtCorp and New Babbage as well is that when it dropped in game and I was there, say in a very early version of Area 18, and I looked up and I saw the building, I was like, oh, I understand the scale now. Now I know what to do with my geometry and my textures to help sell this scale. And New Babbage has been just about the same. We put down these buildings. Obviously, we didn't have the trees for the longest time, which didn't help. But it's like, how are we going to sell the scale with just the assets we have here first before these things come in? So when you dropped in game and you were in the snowy field and you see this huge wall saying Microtech next to you, you start to understand what the scale is. But if you're just flying around making the asset, you kind of lose that sort of aspect.
Yeah, the one thing that's so good and bad in a way about the editor is it's a real-time editor that represents the game as you play it. So a lot of some game engines are like that, but some are not. Some you have to do a build and then you'll be able to play it. But one of the downsides of that is you can zoom around your camera really quickly and you kind of lose that sense of scale and speed as well, because I'm like, oh, I'll look at this and I'll look at this. And so it's really important to keep testing it in the game and actually walking around as a player to see that sense of scale, to not zoom around so much.
And it's an easy mistake to make.
It is. We get caught in that trap all the time, where we're just like, oh, have a look at this, and we'll zoom up to a panel and go, oh, I'm not sure about that panel.
Amazingly how you can build something too big or too small, and you have a good idea in your head of what you want to see, and you build it and you put it, and you're like, wow, this is actually way too small. And
the moment
I measured this, I thought about it, but until I get it and see it and put it down and play it, that's only when you realize.
Well, you guys are struggling with the eternal struggle of the architect in terms of how to design spaces to scale of human beings. This is always, it's even still debated about what's the proper scale of a space, but it's initially when people start off designing buildings for human beings, that's the one thing that is always the first thing that they get wrong, is the scale of the space, because it's so hard to envision that, put yourself actually in the space while you're designing it to understand if it's actually the right size for what you're trying to accomplish.
Well, me and Eddie argue all the time because he's really tall and I'm really short, so we argue about how tall a human is.
I think it's interesting designing from a human scale, because I think in our game as well, we also have to design from a ship scale, because essentially the ships are characters in our game. You spend a lot of time flying around third person in a ship. So it's almost like a different scale again, and you have to design some of it for the human scale, but then you also have to design, especially a lot of the space stuff that the Modular team deals with, a lot of that has to be designed. Is it fun to fly around? Does it look good at the speeds a ship goes, right? So you inevitably end up making things much bigger.
It's becoming more and more of a challenging games, because traditionally games have a one viewpoint. You're an FPS game or you're an RTS game, you've got a top-down view, or you're a driving game or something like that. Whereas games more and more are everything, like our game. You can walk around in a ship, walk around as a player, you can get in a ship, fly around at speed. So we have to design, and you can go into orbit. So we need to make sure that scale read and just the read in general of all of our assets works from the minutiae of close up to I'm in orbit on a planet, like how does that look?
And we don't have like infinite resolution, right? Like that's a huge issue. We have to pick which sacrifices we're actually going to have to make, because we're not going to have bolts on the side of a building because we just can't afford the resolution to do that, right? So it's another balancing act between trying to find what can we get away with, what should we put in, and what should we take out to actually
It's distilling it down to its most basic, bare necessity for getting across the feeling that you are wanting to achieve. Yeah, absolutely. So actually, going back to Microtech, the one thing I wanted to say, because we kind of delved into ArtCorp, but I wanted to say that I think you guys did a really good job with the scale. And I'm not sure if it was intentional, but what I noticed was specifically was that you have a top, a middle, and a base, which is very classical with architecture, because the base helps you understand how big humans are entering it. And because now I can see it connecting with the tree, like in the ground and the trees, I can understand, well, these are little corridors or parks. I start to understand, wow, these are really tall buildings. I can see this as a believable human environment, you know?
Yeah, it was very important to not have like epic monumental walls. Like Louisville has a little bit of that to some extent, and we wanted to make sure it wasn't like you come to the city and then you're looking up and you're like, okay, this is the edge of the city. We wanted to have that layering of that.
I think it makes sense in Louisville to an extent as an enclosed sort of walled fortress of corporation that, you know, puts, but it doesn't make sense for New Babbage. So.
No, and we've been helped so much with the Microtech biomes, with the trees and rocks, to give that sense of scale as you're walking around. And we are, in terms of like actual streets, we want to get like roads in, but right now we're kind of creating paths.
That's interesting. Can I pick your brain on that for a second? Now that you touched on roads, because that's something that I've heard people ask a lot of times: is when can we drive around in ArtCorp? When can we? And that might not ever be possible, but when can we drive around? Because people, I think, have begun to appreciate the scale of these spaces and now want to experience more of that really epic, interesting, cool.
I don't think it's necessarily a question we can answer. I think it is largely a technical question, because obviously filling an entire city out to the detail of something like GTA, but also being able to go into orbit and fly off to another planet, there's huge technical considerations there. It certainly, I think, was something we'd like to do.
The road tour is in the backlog, but we're not looking at it right now.
On the terrain between.
Yeah, like it's more feasible on a terrain than it would be in somewhere like ArtCorp, which is like.
I mean, one of the things we've done with New Babbage that I think really helped that is after we cleared out some space in the trees, we put down the little lampposts. And if you know it's a nighttime and you start seeing these lampposts with these little pin lights going across like a street, that sense the scale suddenly comes back in, and you start to really understand.
Well, now you're starting to say something I actually haven't seen yet, because we've only seen it during the daytime.
We haven't really shown any nighttime shots because we're still working on the nighttime look of New Babbage. We're still tweaking and polishing that. So 3.8 nighttime New Babbage should look pretty cool.
Well, I mean, that sounds like a really cool idea. Lamppost is like one of those not super expensive assets where you just add a little bit of a light with a pole and people can understand, okay, that's a light post. I understand where I am in that space.
Yeah. We don't really, I mean, New Babbage, because it's so cold and we don't really expect like people to go to run and grab out the local paper and go down the shops kind of like outside too often. We do want people to drive around, but it's not going to be like one of those. It's not going to be like, nip out and grab the milk from down the road, if you know what I mean. Like these lampposts are more like way markers kind of thing to mark out, like if you are going out for whatever reason, you know, you want to see your way, basically. Yeah.
So I think we should also touch a little bit on stations a bit. But you guys do landing zones. Do you have any part of?
Well, Eddie's the station master.
I've made stations before. We've all done stations in some kind of way.
Sure. We can talk about them.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
So actually something that I haven't done a video on, but I really have been wanting to put one together, is about the interiors of stations versus the exteriors of stations. And this is actually going to come back to you guys in a bit for landing zones, because it probably is a very similar issue. I've been kind of curious about what the restrictions are in your toolbox with creating interiors that reflect the exterior. Because that's one of the disappointing parts that I found, and no offense, just one of the things I felt was very disconnected when I entered in to a lot of interior spaces, not just in landing zones, but specifically in stations. And I know this first iteration is just this lack, this sort of visual disconnect in the terms of the scale of the exterior and the scale.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's something that we're trying to address a little bit, at least in 3.8. Obviously, we put the new exteriors in 3.7. Which made them much, much, much bigger, and also provided that just diversity of shape and form. We're trying to do that with the interiors as well, but what we don't have is sort of unlimited resources, and I think it becomes a question of how many areas do we want to have in total in the game, or do we want to concentrate the firepower on a single space station? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, on the modular team, we have a slightly more constraint because we work modularly, which means that we generate the layouts rather than handcrafting them. So there's a lot of challenges to come with that because they have to be built in a very specific way just for the tool to work, kind of thing. And then you have to sort of take the architectural considerations into account. I don't think we're going to look at a station interior from the sort of procedural side of things that basically fills an entire interior of one of those stations with traversable space, right? But what we will have are pockets of interiors that you're going to be able to travel around inside one of the stations via elevator. This is a little bit for the future, but that will allow you to sort of get a feeling that you are moving through a bigger space, even though there's not necessarily actual traversable space throughout the whole station. Yeah.
Now, there's one thing I would like to ask you actually about the interior module system. Is there some, and I probably know the answer to this already, restriction on doing a slightly curved interior? Because a lot of the stations you guys have chosen are very circular designs, which are beautiful on the exterior, but the interiors seem very orthogonal.
Yeah, sure. I think it is one of the ways that the procedural tool works, and it works from connection points, and the more you have those connection points on cardinal points of the compass, almost at right angles to one another, the more chance you have for variations of layouts, essentially, because they don't interfere with one another as much. And that's not to say we can't, in the future, start looking at slightly more interesting room layouts for sure. Yeah.
No, because I'd love to see like a more curved interior for some of those spaces that
I
it kind
totally
of extends.
get it. Yeah, absolutely.
There's one thing though that I do want to touch on, especially before we conclude, is about activating the scene with scale. So it's not just about I'm not talking about static objects. I'm talking about moving objects. And one of the things that I've always kind of wanted to see is an interior space or like a landing zone or a station where I have some visual connection with the ships coming and going, with the workers walking back and forth.
Yeah, the life, right?
The life of it.
Yeah.
And so, is there any plans to do something where, like, you have a rest stop or you have a landing zone where there's this cafe that overlooks just one area where ships are landing?
Absolutely, yeah. It's something we talk about a lot, actually, is how to breathe actual life and make it feel like a living, breathing station or a living, breathing landing zone. And that largely comes down to work that actually we're not directly involved with on the AI side of things and stuff like that. But yeah, it's been talked about for ages that we want these places to feel like they are alive and lived in, and they have a sort of day-to-day rhythm, something that probably we can't touch on because we're not actually part of that. But
we always try to get the view. We always try to make sure there's a view, like from the spaceport. Like, we don't have all the AI ships in at the moment, but we're trying to make it so in the future when they come in and they come in masse, that's where you see them. So you will be able to see, every spaceport has like a big vista into the hangars and so on, where you'd see like the traffic going around and. So I've lost my train of thought, but yeah, we do try to future-proof our locations, and like with hubs, like our new hubs in New Babbage, we want to give good views and vistas. So like I was saying in the presentation, if someone's flying around that tower, you'll see that person in your bed.
That is so cool. I think that's one of the big things that's been missing for me as part of the experience of Star Citizen is that visual connection to the outside world.
100%, yeah. Like we kind of treaded softly and cautiously when it came to like opening up spaces too much for
Huge
performance reasons and so on. So like in Art Corp, we've got like a vista from the habitation lobby, but not the hab pods. But it's something we've wanted to do for a long time. So we're actually glad that with New Babbage, we just took that plunge and said, let's just have every hab pod has a window outside. You can see everything. And in the balconies of the hubs, there's like pretty epic vistas, right?
It's pretty open. You know, we do keep those things in mind. So obviously, we have some oversight on the things that we're doing down the line. So whenever we're making a space, we don't make it in a bubble of its current state in the game, obviously. So we try to keep the things that we might be able to do in the future in mind. Sometimes we have to cut some things just because we might not have the time to make it, or it's something that we can come back to later when we have better tech. But we do try to keep those things in mind, for sure.
Cool. That's good to hear. That's one of the most exciting things for me in architecture is having that visual connection to the outside world to help with scale, extend space. And I would argue that's one of the very core pieces of successful architecture that I've yet to see really come in. And in a lot of parts of Star Citizen, I've seen like the starting of it, especially with the new Babbage presentation, that first entry, overlook the vista, overlooking the city, is just wonderful. That's like, if I'm going to review that, I was already thinking Architect Reviews New Babbage. That is going to be one of the coolest ones to review. I just love that work. I couldn't have done it better myself. It's a great challenge.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think like going back to your reviews, there's a really nice feedback loop there, and there's a lot of developers at CIG that watch your stuff with anticipation, and still waiting on a full Art Corp review. But when,
I don't know why I said that. Now it's so much to review.
Yeah, I know you've done the Habs, but
I have,
it'd be really cool to see like a full Art Corp and New Babbage when it comes out.
Well, what I'd like to do is kind of break down the design languages of the different areas, which actually is something I don't know if you said, we kind of go on for a little bit. Are we okay? All right. Is that the design languages are a really core part of the way I review things? Is it consistent? Does it feel nice? Is it achieving what I think the goals you guys set out probably are? And so it is really a big challenge for ArtCorp because there's just so much archetypes of these different buildings to kind of review and kind of put them together. So I will eventually get to that.
No pressure.
But I have seen the new Babbage design language, and I think it's a really interesting thing to finally see from you guys because it's the first real interior design language that it's aside from the utilitarian stuff.
Yeah. It's very refreshing on our side as well to be able to work on a new art style like en masse and really develop it.
Do you think it's harder than utilitarian to make?
Well, it's interesting because when we first started looking into the high-tech styles, we tried all kinds of different stuff out, and we constantly talking to Ian about how do we translate all of our knowledge that we got from utilitarian into this, and it's a very difficult transitioning stage. But some of the artists start to really pick up on that really quick, and you start to see sort of this design language develop even further than what we originally thought with the concepts, right? But to answer your question, I actually think it's easier.
Really?
I think I have more of a maybe.
See, that's
to design the high-tech stuff. Utilitarian.
I think I just personally just have more of an eye for that kind of
No,
stuff.
I actually, if I were in your shoes trying to design the utilitarian stuff, I would also find it more challenging because what is utilitarian in 2949?
good question.
And you also have to make it make sense to today's user because we're not in 2949, we're in 2019.
It's another challenge of making a sci-fi game in general,
Yeah.
or anything sci-fi, is how is it relatable to someone in 2019?
Exactly.
Because you could make some far-off things that could be in the future, but it's not relatable to us at the end
Exactly,
of the day.
and it does have to be relatable in the end. We need to still understand how humans live in that space, what things are, even if we don't understand the technologies behind them. And I think that's why it's been really hard for me to review ships of the utilitarian design, like RSI ships, Drake ships are just really difficult. So I find myself kind of just talking then about the spatial organization versus the design, like the surfaces and the materials themselves, because they're really hard to pick apart.
It's one of the interesting interesting challenges with the utilitarian versus high-tech thing is a panel is a panel. What's the difference between a high-tech panel and a utilitarian panel? That was one of the first things I tried to answer that just boggled my mind.
Well, that's
The curves are high tech. That's what it is.
There's a 45 degree. Come on, we know that.
I mean, personally, I think high tech is a harder style to get than utilitarian. Like utilitarian has pretty definite, at least in our art style, definite visual look. We use 45 degrees.
I think utilitarian, you can just layer things on top of each other so much more, so that you can use lots of different assets in lots of different ways and layer them up to give a general sort of utilitarian style. With the high-tech stuff, you rely on those assets to purely work and those forms and curves to work purely on themselves, on their own. Yeah.
Well, one of the challenges there, modular piece is a lot easier. And one of the challenges we found with the new Babbage is we started making it very modular, and it started to just feel very repeated and not quite, as high-tech and formally as you'd expect. So what we ended up having to do is, create a lot more custom pieces to sort of bring everything together, and, like longer wall pieces that might curve into other things. And that's something that I've found very refreshing and fun to work on personally.
Yeah, I think that's the actual challenge that you've hit in a nutshell. Basically, the utilitarian, you can layer like 4 panels next to each other, 4 wall pieces, and you want variation obviously, but you can do that and make you can make a lot of different variety of rooms out of a kit. With high tech, you want those forms to flow through the room, so and change as it flows through the room. So you need larger bespoke pieces. It's more bespoke artwork. It's not necessarily harder in terms of like the modeling, but it's definitely more time consuming, because you can't just repeat the same shapes. It's harder on the performance because curves means more polygons and so on, and more layering of materials and so on. I think it's a really cool look.
Offset that a little bit with the high-tech style because you need fewer props and clutter, because
it's more minimal for sure. Yeah. Yes, less is more. We say that a lot.
Less is ideal.
Less is better, which is what I prefer, but
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, it's so interesting to hear you guys talk about this and be able to finally sit down with you guys.
it's really cool. It's why I grabbed you. It's really cool to actually have someone
mirror
our work, review our work from a real design language perspective, an architectural perspective. It's really cool.
Because again, we ain't architects.
I think, I think it's a good validation of games in general, like in that whole games as an art form kind of argument of saying, like, if someone's reviewing our work from a design perspective as if it is real, like the ships and so on, the functionality and design language, versus just this game looks cool because the graphics are cool kind of thing. You're actually reviewing it from that, and I think that goes to show, like, it's proving that games as an art form is growing and maturing. And I think, the technology's improved a lot. While a long time ago, you wouldn't be able to review game assets in that way because it would be so blocky, and the technology has limited it. You'd be able to review it and like, oh, that's good level design, but is that good? Like, how is that functional in terms of like it being real?
Yeah.
I think that's what's so cool about watching your videos.
Well, I think you guys have a real challenge ahead of you because you're doing things that are not precedented for designs, because you're going to that level of detail where you're considering the human scale in a virtual environment in a believable way. You start to ask, okay, how do spaceships fly into this building? But architects have that problem. We've never had to address that issue. Maybe helicopters, sure, but not big spaceships.
Well, we're addressing it for you. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So no, like, you guys are on the edge of maybe where we're going to be.
We were joking the other day because our ships are so realistic in terms of, it's not just fake. Like, the landing gear has to fit into a cavity. Like, when they design a ship, they need to design all the spaces so the engine needs to fit into a space. It's not just faked. Like, the landing gear doesn't go just retract into a polygon or something. It needs physical space, and we were joking, like, in the future, someone's going to recreate our ships for real because they have to work.
Well, they might use your stuff as precedent because you've thought so much about it. It's like, Oh, that's how we could resolve panelization when we're mass producing 3D printed buildings at large scale.
I mean, that would be amazing. Like if that was the case. In
No,
the
but
future.
seriously, no, there are really interesting parallels because we're starting to get into a 3D printing world with architecture, and we start to ask very real questions that you guys have to answer. Is we have real restrictions with the amount of material we can use. The cost curves are very, very expensive.
I think it's funny, we talk about costs a lot. You're talking about real world costs, and I think that old sort of saying, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy kind of thing. I presume on the architecture side of things, you can create the most beautiful designs for things, but then it has to go through the engineers and the building materials and stuff. And what comes out the other side isn't always necessarily what you envisioned at the start.
Well, ideally, the best architects push that as far forward as they possibly can. But the reality is,
I think that's very much the same on our side of things. But we have to go through. I mean, we work with design to design the space, but we then have to go through performance and rendering and budgets and stuff like that. So, yeah, exactly. You start with a very, very strong idea for a space, and you push it as far as you can to try and achieve that goal at the end of it, making compromises along the way, essentially.
And it's definitely something we talk about often, like the amount of times I've sat down with, say, Ian, the art director, and we've talked about how this form is too expensive to make if someone wants to make it in real life, so we've got to change it. You know, these costs and like real life fabrication kind of situations is something we talk about a lot as well.
Yeah, it's like the panel breakup. Like if one panel is 400 meters long, you know, on the side of a building, it doesn't. It's like, how is that actually made? How is it created? So we think about that not only from a technical performance in the game point of view, but also how is it constructed in the real world point of view as well. Yeah.
So I mean, it helps direct your design in a way that makes it both visually believable, but also helps you, I think, resolve design too, because you can keep designing forever, and you really do need restrictions. I find myself needing restrictions to kind of keep myself on track to get something at least to a point where I'm happy with it. Never done, but happy with it.
Yeah, an artist's work is never done, but it's always time is our biggest restriction, and performance, polygons, and so on. But sometimes having some limitation actually makes us more creative. We have to.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's always unlimited ability, like with certain CGI in films where they can do whatever they want. It just looks bad because it's not.
I would argue that
feasible.
time is a massive.
Time is a big restriction.
Massive restriction for those guys as well.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
If you leave an artist to themselves for a long time, or even an architect, they'll go forever.
Well, we could tinker forever. We could work on one landing zone forever, and we wouldn't release it. You know.
Which is why I have never finished a personal project.
It's true. Well, guys, this has been an absolute pleasure sitting down and talking to you. Do you have any final things you wanted to ask me?
I mean, it's been a pleasure watching your videos. It's been a pleasure talking to you now. I think it's been great, and keep doing what you're doing, because I think it only enhances, not just our kind of conversation, as it were, in terms of design, but also a wider kind of industry conversation in terms of art in games. And yeah, as a token of our appreciation, I brought something back from Art Corp for you, a little turtle.
A turtle. Oh my gosh, that's so. I've been seeing.
They've
these
been
things
dotted around the. I don't know who's
Yeah.
been placing them, but they've been dotted around the venue. So we've been finding them.
That's really funny.
And,
Thank you. So is this mine? Can I?
Yeah.
All right.
But yeah, we're watching, we're sharing, we love the videos, so keep at it.
You do more environmental reviews, because you do a lot of ships.
I do.
And us environment artists are like,
okay.
more environments.
I will do more environment. No, I want to. It's just sometimes
We appreciate
it's
the ship ones as well a lot.
Yeah, I will actually. I do want to. Is the expo center going to stay around after the event is over, or is it temporary?
It's well, the building's there, the transit line's there, the idea is there. We don't really have a use for it afterwards, so we're not really sure if maybe something we can do with that space in the future. But it is there.
It's really cool because I'd like to actually talk a little bit about that and some design, because I think it's really, really well done. Obviously, New Babbage is going to be something I want to talk about. I think it's been one of the coolest places to talk about in recent memory.
No pun intended. You fell into that one. I do like a good pun.
And then stations, I can't wait to look at those interiors and actually start, because I think you guys have really touched on some really cool things, like making the windows a central hub area. I think that's a really great direction. I can't wait to talk about that in a video. more precisely. Sorry, we didn't get to touch too much on the stations, and I really
No, dude, that's absolutely fine.
I think we could spend another 2 hours talking about this stuff. We could.
Yeah. Appreciate it. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
absolutely. Thank you guys so much for dropping by and actually, being cool
They
about
can't see
sticking
it,
around.
but
And
I'm shaking your hand.
I don't know if they can see.
Well,
like I'm accepting
only
a
half you
trophy.
guys are on a camera.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, cheers. Well, thanks, guys, for watching. See you around.